What's up, guys? Today we're going to be covering part 1 of the NSCA-CPT exam review. This is going to be client consultation. This is an important part for a lot of people to focus on because a lot of it is not something that you have from just background experience with going to the gym. We've got to make sure you understand the process of the client consultation, all the steps in it. We've got to make sure that you know when medical clearance is needed. You need to know how to identify risk factors and identify cardiovascular disease signs and symptoms. You need to understand low versus moderate versus vigorous intensity and how to define it. So as for the steps of a client consultation, you're going to schedule the interview, you're going to conduct it. So you want to assess the compatibility, the suitability, the expectations, the boundaries, exercise readiness, make sure you develop all that. You want to develop SMART goals. That's just an acronym meaning specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. As for the paperwork that has to be filled out, there's a trainer-client agreement. So that covers the expectations and the responsibilities of the trainer and the client. There's a client facility agreement that covers what the facility is and isn't responsible for. Then there's a PAR-Q or the medical questionnaire. The PAR-Q is less in depth. It will just ask questions about the signs and symptoms of cardiovascular disease. The medical questionnaire is more in depth, which will ask questions about current conditions, previous conditions, and so on. The lifestyle questionnaire is designed to assess factors related to longevity, such as dietary intake, stress management, physical activity level, drinking, smoking, and so on. The informed consent form talks about the risks and the benefits so that they can accept them in an informed manner. And the assumption of risk is essential to protect the personal trainer in court in the event that something did happen due to negligence. After all the paperwork is complete, you evaluate the risk factors and you determine if they need to be referred medically before starting a new fitness program. To determine if you need to get medical clearance prior to starting a new fitness program, ask 3 questions. Number 1, do they participate in regular exercise? That's defined as participating in 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise at least 3 days per week for at least 3 months, aka the 3-3-3 rule. We'll talk more about what moderate intensity entails later. Number 2, do they have diagnosed cardiovascular, metabolic, or renal disease? Cardiovascular disease would be cardiac, peripheral vascular, or cerebrovascular disease. Metabolic disease would be type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and renal disease is just kidney disease. Third factor is if they have signs or symptoms of cardiovascular disease. That will include pain or discomfort in the chest, neck, jaw, arms, or other areas due to ischemia, that's lack of blood flow, shortness of breath at rest or with mild exertion, dizziness or syncope, which is a medical term for fainting, orthopnea, which is a need to stand up to breathe well. Then there's paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, which is breathlessness during sleep, which often leads to them waking up while they're sleeping. There's ankle edema, which is abnormal buildup of fluid in the ankles. Palpitations, which are abnormal beatings of the heart. Tachycardia, which is defined as heart rate exceeding 100 beats per minute. Intermittent claudication, which is pain in the lower extremities that occurs during exercise and stops after. Heart murmur, which is a whooshing sound that's heard on a stethoscope. And finally, unusual fatigue or shortness of breath that occurs with regular activity. Next, you're going to use this chart to determine if they need to be referred or not. So first question, do they participate in regular exercise? That's defined by do they do at least 30 minutes of exercise at least 3 times per week for the last 3 months. If the answer is no, you go on the left. If it's yes, you go on the right. And next, you categorize them based on a few factors. So first off, do they have any signs or symptoms suggestive of cardiovascular, metabolic, or renal disease? If so, you always need to refer them. If they're currently exercising, they need to stop and seek clearance. If they're not, they need to be cleared before they start a program. Next category, if they have a known cardiovascular, metabolic, or renal disease, but they don't have any symptoms of cardiovascular disease or signs. In that case, if they're not currently exercising, they need to be cleared before they start a program. If they are, then they can do moderate exercise, but they need to be cleared before they start vigorous intensity exercise. And next category, they don't have any metabolic, renal, or cardiovascular disease, and they don't have any signs or symptoms of it. In that case, medical clearance is not necessary. Next, we're going to talk about risk factors. So remember, we don't use risk factors to determine if we need clearance. We use a chart and the acronym I taught in the previous slides. Less than 2 risk factors is low risk, 2 or more is moderate risk, and if they have symptoms of cardiovascular disease or no disease, then they're high risk. Now, as for some basic definitions in physiology, LDL, low-density lipoprotein, also known as bad cholesterol, forms plaques that can block arteries and can lead to cardiovascular events. So LDL, bad, remember that. HDL, high-density lipoprotein, also known as good cholesterol, it helps clear the dangerous LDL plaque buildups in the arteries. Now, as for the basics of blood pressure, there are 2 numbers. There's systolic and diastolic. Systolic is going to be the first number you see. Diastolic is going to be the second. Systolic is the blood pressure that the blood has against the artery walls when the heart is contracted. So when it's compressed, leading to higher pressure. Diastolic is the pressure the blood has on the artery walls when the heart is dilated. I mean, it's decompressed, which will lead to less pressure. BMI stands for body mass index. The formula is weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. Myocardial infarction, that's another word for heart attack. So we see that, just think heart attack. And now let's talk about glucose. So glucose is the main type of sugar in the blood and is a major source of energy for cells of the human body. Insulin is released by the pancreas into the bloodstream in response to elevated glucose levels in the blood. Now, insulin binds to cells and signals them to let glucose in, uptake it, and use it. Now, diabetes is an issue with blood glucose regulation. There are two different types. Type 1 is that there are inadequate amounts of insulin being produced by the pancreas. And that leads to the lack of ability of cells to uptake glucose because they're not being signaled by insulin to uptake glucose. Type 2 is when the insulin receptors on cells have tolerance to insulin. So there's insulin insensitivity, and they don't uptake glucose in response to insulin adequately. Now, as for the risk factors, the bad risk factors are age, if they're over 45 for men or 55 for women, if they have family history of myocardial infarction, coronary revascularization, or sudden death before 55 in a biological father or another male first relative, or before 65 for mother or female relative. HDL, high-density lipoprotein, less than 40, that's a risk factor. Remember, HDL is a good cholesterol. We won't have more of that. LDL, low-density lipoprotein, more than 130. Total cholesterol, more than 200. Fasting blood glucose, more than 100. 2-hour glucose tolerance test, more than 140. Or HbA1c, more than 5.7%. Next off, it's if they're a current smoker, a previous smoker who quit in the last 6 months, or if they have environmental smoke exposure. Sedentary lifestyle, so again, use the 3-3-3 rule. If they haven't gone at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise at least 3 days a week for the last 3 months. Obesity, BMI, more than 30, waist circumference greater than 40 for men, or more than 35 for women. Hypertension, that's defined as systolic blood pressure more than 130, or diastolic blood pressure more than 80. So normal is considered 120 over less than 80. That's a normal blood pressure. Next off, if there have been any atherosclerotic cardiovascular events in males under 55 or females under 65 in their family, then that's another risk factor. Now for the negative risk factor, there's only one. These are good risk factors. So you subtract a bad risk factor if you have a negative risk factor. And that's if your high-density lipoproteins or good cholesterol is more than 60. And as for the units we use, we have millimeters mercury for the blood pressure. That's a measurement of pressure. And then we have milligrams per deciliter, which is a measure of concentration, which is used for a lot of other stuff. The last thing we're going to talk about is intensity. To understand intensity, you have to understand these terms. So there's resting heart rate. That's how many beats per minute you have at rest when you're doing nothing. You have max heart rate. That's the highest beats per minute possible. So there are a few different ways that can be measured. So you can estimate it with the formula 220 minus your age or 208 minus 70% of your age, or it can be tested with either a maximal or a submaximal test. The submaximal test is simply to estimate it, while a maximal test is directly measuring it. And then we have heart rate reserve. The acronym HRR will be seen a lot, and that's a difference between max heart rate and resting heart rate. So if I have a resting heart rate of, say, 80 and a max of 180, then my heart rate reserve will be 100. So that's like heartbeats per minute in the bank that aren't used yet. And then metabolic equivalence, 1 met equals the amount of energy burned by the body at rest. So if you do absolutely nothing, you're at 1 met. Now, for exercise, there will be different categories of different met ranges, and it's relative to how much you burn doing nothing. So, for example, moderate might be 5.5 mets. So while you do that activity, that's 5.5 mets, you burn 5.5 as much energy as you would doing nothing. And then lastly, we have rating of perceived exhaustion, RPE. And that's a scale that, there are two different ways you see it. There's 1 to 10, that's a modified scale. That's a lot more people-friendly. And then there's 6 to 20, that's called the Borg scale. And it's very common in research. And the lowest number, 1 or 6, represents the lowest effort, while the highest number, 10 and 20, represents max effort, the highest someone can possibly go. And as for the intensity levels, the easiest way to go about this is just to remember what moderate is, and if it's higher than moderate, you know it's vigorous. If it's lower than moderate, you know it's low. But for moderate, it's going to be 40 to 59% heart rate reserve. So that means you take 40 to 59% of what the heart rate reserve is, the difference between the max heart rate and the resting heart rate, and you add that to the resting heart rate, and that's what your heart rate is going to be while you train in that zone. 3 to 5.9 mets, and then RPE 12 to 13. And once again, that's on the Borg scale. And then additionally, you can use a talk test to see if they're moderate intensity, and the basic idea is in moderate intensity, they're able to carry out a conversation, they're able to talk to you. Vigorous intensity, they're not able to.